Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Yannick Vogel, and this is my project called Commodification of Persons, Exploitation of Data and the Effects on the Sharing Economy. The purpose of this video is to introduce you to all of the different chapters in my research, and as such, we will be going through them one by one. To start off, of course, with chapter 1, which deals with the notion of commodities and commodification. There I argue that there are many different definitions of commodities and commodification, and they're all part of economic political theories. And now the theories that I mainly discuss are those of Karl Marx, Karl Polanyi, Jane Radin, the Chicago School of Economics, and a scholar named Arjun Appadurai. So commodity concepts can be divided into two main categories. The first one is object-based. And what I mean with that is that the commodity concept focuses on the object of commodification. For instance, Karl Marx says, commodities are objects that exist outside of us, that have value, use value, and exchange value. Alternatively, Karl Polanyi says now, commodities are those objects created for sale on the market. And so the difference between those object-based definitions and the situation-based definition is that the situation-based definition focuses not on which object is a commodity, but which exchange is a commodity exchange. And therefore, the commodity status is dictated by the social nature of an exchange and not by the object in itself. And so what I do then is I excavate all of the different sources of commodityness, if you will. So there are many different observables, as Luciano Floridi would call them, that describe the commodity status of an object. We won't go through all of them, but some quite obvious ones are that objects have to be transferable, have to be desirable, commensurable, have value, all these sort of features. So the next thing that I do is I go to the state of the art when it comes to the application of such commodity theories. Because in the 1970s, people started wondering what commodities are generated in mass media. Since it is a sector that was generating more and more value, it was understandable that people were wondering, well, where does the commodity theory apply here? So in the 1970s, Dallas Smythe answers this question when he says that the commodity that mass media generates is the audience itself. And then later on, in around 2009, 2010, a scholar named Christian Fuchs sort of departs from that idea and starts to analyze how the audience commodity can be understood in digital mass media. And digital mass media has to be understood in a broad way here, including search engines, social media, news outlets, those kind of media. And then what you see is that there's, if you look at the three spheres at the bottom, there's a general commodity theory that we have described in chapter 1, and then there's the audience commodity theory that sort of borderlines on that. But a third theory here is that it is data really that is the main source of commodification in digital economies. So in chapter 2 I focus on that as well, the idea of data as a commodity, and I describe the four approaches where we can have data as a true standalone commodity, for instance when it's understood as a package sold to data brokers. Data as property or as ownership is an interesting academic debate. Same goes for data as intellectual property. And finally, I described the co-generated data approach to explain the source of value. So the first two chapters sort of clear up the use of the word commodity and the notion thereof, and sees how it's been applied to audiences or to data to explain where value is created in digital mass media systems and where its value comes from. And then I start to contribute to the state of the art. Because in my opinion, we need a new cell and we need a new frame of the cell. And what I mean with that is that the commodity is often described as the cell form of value, the smallest unit of wealth. As we have seen in chapter 1, it has many different definitions. But also the content of the cell, either audiences or data, is subject to debate. And I want to put forward an idea where we rewrite both of these notions. And so in order to do that, in chapter 3, I go into quite a long and elaborate theoretical background research on the notion of commodification and the functions that it has. And in doing so, I used the philosophy by John Searle called The Construction of Social Reality, where he basically says, well, X counts as Y in the context of C in order to describe social facts. And I argue here that if we would put this in quite the aforementioned stramina, you would get something like audiences count as a commodity in the context of the Dallas-Smythe theory. Alternatively, you could say data counts as a commodity in other theories, in other contexts. This is perhaps a bit too much to explain here in full, so I will show you how it's going to be applied in the 4th chapter, where I depart from the idea of X, of the commodified objects, or as the content of the cell, which I argue needs to be replaced. And so chapter 4 deals with what I call the new human commodity. There are many different sort of proposals on which aspects of persons are being commodified, being their personalities, their digital emotions, their data, their captured attention. What I argue is that we need to see a value chain, a digital value chain, from the very beginning to the very end. This is always based on 4 premises, whichever sort of holistic theory you examine. There's the idea of data collection, data refinement, and then there's a certain effect on person and the sale of that effect on persons. So in chapter 4, I sort of juxtapose a new type of expended human energy against labor. Because those who have read Karl Marx or Karl Polanyi know that labor is always the peculiar commodity or the fictitious commodity. And there's a real difficulty in understanding human expended energy as an object of commodification. And so without elaborating too much here, I argue that influenced human action shaped through computational power in the digital milieu, which expresses itself through actions which persons would not have taken without digital mediation, and which benefits the expressor of power in a material or immaterial manner, is a new type of human energy that is expended and that can be understood as a commodity. And so in chapter 5, we need to return to commodity theory, because the object that we have just described, lengthy quote from before, needs to be understood in classical commodity theory. But the problem there is that many of the observables that we have discovered for the notion of the commodity in chapter 1 do not fit the object that we have just described. And so we run into a problem where we either understand the object that we have just described as not a commodity, which then doesn't allow us to explain value generated in digital systems. And so therefore, I start applying these observables to the notion of algorithmically induced human behavior. And there, several things stand out. A lot of the old observables don't really function so well, but the main problem lies in the idea of accessibility instead of transferability. And the whole problem with this revolves around the concept of alienability of labor versus the alienability of one's own thoughts and desires. Again, this is a bit too much to explain in full here, but the idea is generally that the transfer and exchange observables have been replaced with the accessibility observables. And so what I argue is that accessibility then acts as this mediating factor between exchange and transfer, and it replaces those ideas and therefore allows us to update the theory of commodification in a meaningful way. And then in chapter 6, I introduced the idea of the sharing economy, which at first glance might not seem related at all. It's a very over and under defined concept. There's no academic agreement here. But the idea of the sharing economy is that whatever object flow in it, they're all access-based markets, and they don't deal with the idea of true exchange and transfer. So I argue in general that if we want to understand the context in which the commodity of influenced human behavior revolves, then the sharing economy is a perfect way to understand it, because it already allows us to fully grasp the infrastructure that it has placed for other commodities. So I conclude that commodity theory and novel economy mismatch in the objects that they produce, and that there's a real chance to restore this if you update the theory of commodification based on the new characteristics of the objects that flow around in data capitalist economies. So that was it for me. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.